Department of Homeland Security is reviewing footage from body cameras worn by ICE officers during the fatal shooting of Alex Preddy on Saturday. A DHS official tells MS Now there is video from several angles investigators are looking through. When asked at yesterday's press briefing whether the footage would be made public, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said, quote, "That's not something I've heard the president commit to." Joining us now, former police commissioner of New York City and Boston, Bill Bratton. He also is a former chief of police in Los Angeles and author of the 2020 book, The Profession, a memoir of community, race, and the arc of policing in America. Commissioner Bratton, always great to have you with us. We were with you after the shooting death of Renee Good a couple of weeks ago, and now here we are, another shooting death, this time of Alex Preddy in the streets of Minneapolis, an ICU nurse at the VA hospital there in that city. So, first of all, what you see in the video, Commissioner Bratton, that's one part of this, but also what kind of investigation would follow immediately if this were the NYPD or the Los Angeles Police Department?
The investigation would be extraordinarily thorough to the greatest degree possible. We'd try to keep the public aware of the various stages of that investigation. And that is one of the more troubling aspects of what has been happening, this lack of transparency and the lack of information that's being provided. And what it also has created, unfortunately, is a lack of trust in agencies for which we had phenomenal trust, the FBI and other agencies who would normally be brought in to do these investigations, particularly after the first shooting incident. Great concern about the quality of the investigation. And then we turn out, find out there's not going to be an investigation. They've made a decision that everything was okay here, so why do we need to investigate it? No, this one here, I think, is the watershed moment that where I think the federal government is coming to appreciate that they have to change significantly the way they've been going about these operations, because it's totally counter to everything we've been trying to do in American policing for the last 40 years that I've been associated with it.
Well, talk about that, if you will, Mr. Commissioner. You talked about the quality of the investigation. I want to talk about the quality of the policing. I mean, even laymen looking can see that a lot of these agents just seem to be bumbling around. There's 6 or 7 around people. They don't seem to know what they're doing. And we commented on the situation with Alex Preddy. If something like that had happened in New York, NYPD would have had 1 or 2 guys. He would have been restrained or down on the ground and then restrained. Instead of having 6 or 7 guys bouncing off of him, just being incompetent there, you just don't see that. The policing, first of all, pushing a woman into a snowbank and then running out, out of the street, chasing after these people, and then all of these guys just swarming around him. You'll see soon somebody being hit, somebody hitting him in the head. So just talk about just how poor the policing has been from what you've seen, not only in this tragic video, but in all the other videos that have come out of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and across the country.
You're hitting the nail on the head. The quality of the enforcement activities by ICE and the many agencies that they're now working with on these immigration issues is extraordinarily poor. Lack of supervision, lack of leadership, lack of coordination, lack of training. American policing has come a long way in the last 40 or 50 years. And what we are seeing so publicly every day is a total contradiction of what American policing has been attempting to do. De-escalation, controlled use of force, increased supervision, increased community interaction with the public, community policing. All of this is being constantly violated by these initiatives. It is extraordinarily upsetting. Me personally, as a former member of law enforcement, who comments on it, but all of my colleagues who are still in the profession are increasingly disturbed by the fractures in, the relationship with the federal agencies, that we're very close, and that collaboration has helped to reduce crime dramatically in this country the last several years. We should be, at this time, celebrating the dramatic declines in homicides and crime in general, instead of every night on the nightly news watching these scenes playing out of chaos, law enforcement chaos. Think of this, Minneapolis, 58 square miles, the size of Staten Island, 450,000 residents, about the population of Staten Island, to surge 3,000 federal agents into that small geographic area and then watch the tactics that they're using. They're not tactics. Where's the supervision?
Right.
Where's the control? Where's the leadership? No, in terms of, I'm hoping that Holman, when he comes in, is able to get his arms around this. He was applauded, ironically, by Obama back in, I think, 2014 or 15, for his efforts during the time of dealing with immigration during Obama's time. Hopefully, he'll be the grown-up in the room and begin to get some control over these initiatives, because it is so damaging, not only to the federal government agencies, but to American law enforcement. They're undoing 40 years of advancement, undoing it, and it's a shame.
When you look at Tom Homan's career, he has the capacity. He has the capacity to do what you're talking about. I want to ask you, Mr. Commissioner, about the importance of the public trust, whether it's federal, state, local, or community law enforcement. And moving Bovino, is that necessarily enough in the grand scheme of things? And you have DHS saying he might even be keeping his job. Not clear whether he's completely being removed. But you have other officials, Kristi Noem, Stephen Miller, who seem to have defamed the victim in this case. At least they didn't wait for an investigation to bear out any information. They rushed to judgment. Even Kash Patel, as they changed their stories, weighing in. And it seemed to really strike not just many Americans, but Republicans as impunity, lying with impunity, just jumping to conclusions to paint this person as somehow someone who meant to massacre ICE agents. How do you, in a situation like this, what would even some steps be beyond this Bovino move to restore the public trust and the credibility of the federal government? Is it possible in light of what has happened? And why would that be important?
Well, I think one of the issues is, as you just outlined, naming all those officials, there are too many cooks in the kitchen. Traditionally, when there is an incident in an American city, you have the mayor, you have the police chief, you may have the governor, will do the news conference, but then the police chief going forward is the central spokesperson, as that person usually has the most information about the investigation. Here you have all these talking heads on the Sunday talk shows, basically playing from the same cheat sheet, and they really don't have the background to talk intelligently about what is in fact happening. So one of the things I hope that Mr. Holman does is effectively become the face of this, where there is one person speaking for the administration who has some facts to speak about, so that we're not putting out misinformation and we're not creating all the confusion that has been generated in these investigations, or lack of investigations.
Commissioner, there's a lot of talk today about perhaps a slight de-escalation in Minnesota, but we don't know what this administration will do next, both in Minneapolis or around the country, in terms of ICE operations, Border Patrol operations, and the like. White House officials did tell us right before the new year that New York City, a city you know better than anybody, would be on the list for the first part of 2026. They would ramp up activities here. That hasn't happened yet. It may not. But if it were to, what do you think that would look like in a city you mentioned? Minneapolis is the size of just Staten Island. New York City is far, far bigger and denser than that. What would happen if those operations, in a similar manner, were attempted to be conducted in the nation's biggest city?
One, it would be a nightmare. The nation's biggest city, one of the most important cities in the world, the news media that are in New York City, not having to fly in from all over the country, the attention that would be given to it. NYPD has extraordinarily good capabilities, as you're all aware. It does not need 3,000 federal agents to work on issues in that city. What is missing here is what American policing has learned over the last 30 years to do is precision policing, not dragnet, but precision policing. What we're watching is dragnet, wound up, it's like the old Casablanca movie, wound up twice the usual suspects. No, American policing has gotten much better at precision policing, go after the bad guys. You know how to do it. U.S. Marshal Service has been doing this successfully for years, modeled the federal effort after what the U.S. Marshal Service does. There are extraordinary capabilities within the federal government. There are great partnerships between police and federal agencies, but they are being frayed as a result of this shotgun approach that they're taking. I'm hoping, again, that as this goes forward, that we'll learn from these incidents. The idea, you always try to learn from these incidents, certainly. And again, going to New York City would accomplish nothing. I think it would be a nightmare for everybody. It's not needed.
Yeah, let me ask you to that point. When Barack Obama was in office, you had states like California and New York cooperating. If there were illegal immigrants that were in the jails, then those states would cooperate with DHS and the federal government. And that is in part how Barack Obama deported so many, if not the worst of the worst, at least people who'd committed crimes. Do you think states like New York and California should continue that cooperation with the Trump administration? So if there are people who came here illegally and they are incarcerated in jail, should they be handed over to DHS so they can be deported back to their home countries?
Joe, the source of some of this problem began actually back, I became commissioner in New York in 2014. And New York at that time described itself as a number of cities around the country did, as sanctuary cities. And one of the things that sanctuary cities were doing was putting restrictions on the turning over of individuals who'd been arrested for crimes, illegal immigrants, turning them over to the federal government for deportation proceedings. So in New York, there's a significant number of restrictions, for example, on when a person can be turned over to the federal authorities, what paperwork is necessary. So that was the beginning of some of the significant tensions underway here. I think there's some room for modification of that modifications to sanctuary city policies that can alleviate some of these tensions. Because the whole thrust of this was to take the worst of the worst, the criminals, those that have committed crime, and get them out of the country. But this dragnet now where I live in a community out in Long Island that's about 35, 40% Latino, largely the working class out there. And the fear among that community, as I go down to the local 7-Eleven for my papers and coffee in the morning, and the fear up at the other 7-Eleven up in Southampton Village, where there used to be 15, 30, 40 of these immigrants looking for work each day, it's palpable. And it's heart-rending in the sense of what this is doing to my neighbors and to their kids.
Yeah, it's absolutely terrible. And I will say, going back to what you were saying about sanctuary cities, I think most Americans would agree that if somebody's here illegally, they're charged and convicted and incarcerated, no city, no state should be protecting those people. That's exactly who Americans want deported, the worst of the worst.
Yeah, we have a very different situation playing out. Former NYPD Commissioner Bill Bratton, thank you very much for coming on the show this morning. We really appreciate it.